I am in Albuquerque, New Mexico at the Albuquerque Museum of Art and History. I'm actually here for an exhibit on Mexican modernism, but this is my very first time at this museum, so I figured in this video we'll check out the permanent exhibits. So let's go take a look. Before heading inside the museum, I want to check out some of the outdoor sculptures, of which there are plenty. This sculpture is called Bear with Clouds and Plains, which literally features a giant bear silhouette with clouds and plains passing in front. This historical marker is dedicated to the founding women of Albuquerque back in 1706. This is Oliver Legrone's Mercy, an homage to his mother. This sculpture is called The Prayer. It depicts an Apache with outstretched arms. This bronze seal depicts the famous 20th century dancer Isadora Duncan. This is titled The Park Place by Glenna Goodacre, and it appears to be a grouping of bronze people doing everyday people things. And this is probably the most impressive sculpture out here, La Jornada. This sprawling bronze statue grouping was done by Betty Sabo and Ronaldo Sonny Rivera. It was started in 1998 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the Spanish arrival in New Mexico. Leading the charge is Juan de Oñate, a very controversial figure who was removed from the governorship in 1614 because he massacred so many natives. When the first group of Spanish colonists arrived in 1598, there were about 400 Spanish men, some of whom brought their families, with 83 carts and wagons like this one, and thousands of animals. Also, there's a pig. There are some more sculptures on the other side of the museum, but I'll save those for later. I did make a special trip out to this museum because of the Frida Kahlo exhibit, which was absolutely fantastic and is featured in a separate video linked in the description, so check that one out after you watch this one. Now let's head into the Albuquerque Museum of History and Art. First we're going to head into the art portion of the museum, which is really all that's open right now, but this looks to be an intriguing gallery. This is going to be mostly Albuquerque and New Mexico based artwork by Albuquerque and New Mexico based artists. Here are some historical depictions of Albuquerque. There's Old Town, and this one depicts the new town in 1885. This is titled Night on Central Avenue, painted in 1946. This post-war painting of Albuquerque is pretty depressing compared to most artwork from other times. That is a fantastic and serious painting of a wolf called Survivor. And here's a not so serious derpy wolf. This is Fritz Schulder's portrait in a white suit from 1983, featuring some native iconography. Here's an entire wall of portraiture in some alternating styles. There's also a rooster head up here for some reason. This strange multi-faced sculpture is called Earl. It was inspired by the premature death of Crow artist Earl Biss. This is a really cool sculpture of a wolf howling. There's a sculpture of Albuquerque-based writer Rodolfo Anaya, and a Joseph Henry Sharp painting called Indian by Firelight. There's a portrait of 12-year-old future governor Bruce King, and there's a portrait of the governor when he was much older. He actually served 3 non-consecutive terms as governor of New Mexico. This painting is called Los Musicos by Romero de Romero, depicting 3 New Mexican musicians. Here is the New Mexican goat herder. The artist William Herbert Dunton was inspired to paint this by a local Taos goat herder, and this painting hung in many major exhibitions during the 1920s and 30s. This is a portrait of Francisco Armillo y Otero and his wife Margarita. They were a very wealthy couple here in turn of the century Albuquerque. This is the Pueblo Woman of Taos by Oscar Burninghouse. This was apparently displayed at the 1939 New York World's Fair. This is Ernest L. Blumenstein's Star Road and White Sun. This is somewhat a critique of Native American assimilation. Blumenstein did a lot to advocate for Native religious rights. The painting on the right is called Indian Hunting, though it just depicts a Native American looking out into space, as by 1908 when this was painted, there wasn't much left to hunt, and things had really changed for them. Here's a collection of small statuary, including some busts. This may well be my favorite piece in here, the Starkey's Trading Post diorama. This was made in 1986, but it was inspired by the old trading posts in this region, most of which were abandoned by the time this was made. Of course, there are many dilapidated trading posts like this along Route 66. You can see the painted teepee, that was pretty common. And there's also a JFK was here in 1961 sign. I love these authentic trading posts and still search out the ones that are left. They are remarkable pieces of nostalgia. This is called the Carlsbad Trilogy. They are really colorful and somewhat sci-fi depictions of Carlsbad caverns. This painting is titled A Shower in a Dry Year by Peter Hurd. These are some more New Mexico landscapes, depicting some classic adobe structures with mountains. This is an excerpt from a poem titled Veterano Sanctuary by Carlos Contreras. It blends English and Spanish. They do have a collection of Hispanic folk art. These wooden pieces are often fascinating. There are some crucifixes and figurines of the Virgin of Guadalupe. There's a blue casemate window made by Jose Dolores Lopez for his home in the early 1900s, and a tin nicho from around 1900. There is a plaque depicting President Theodore Roosevelt made by sculptor James Earl Fraser, who also created the controversial Teddy Roosevelt statue at the American Museum of Natural History, which is supposedly going to be removed. Here are some more historic furnishings and paintings from the region. Some are from the Spanish colonial period. I do love this Spanish-American War commemorative hat rack, featuring Commodore Dewey, Admiral Winfield Scott Schley, and the USS Maine. There is a classic bronze statue of a cowboy and his horse. Sadly, it is not a Remington. And below it is the Boland saddle, a highly detailed bronze saddle sculpted by a famous saddle maker named Gordon Snidow. This is Paul Berlin's abstraction from 1918. He was one of the more radical and abstract artists living in New Mexico in the early 20th century. This painting is called The Artist and the Showman, East Coast, West Coast, featuring Buffalo Bill and Herman Melville. I guess this pokes at colonial attitudes. This is fantastic. The Great American Country Music Showcase Hall of Fame. This folk art carving features 28 famous country musicians. It's like a big Grand Ole Opry gathering. It's topped with fiddles and a very American guitar. Hank Williams stands at the top of the Hall of Fame. Patsy Cline and Tammy Wynette are also up here, along with the singing cowboys Gene Autry and Roy Rogers. There's Johnny Cash, along with June Carter, Loretta Lynn, Merle Haggard, Waylon Jennings, Ernest Tubb, Bill Monroe, and George Jones. Down here there's Willie Nelson, Dolly Parton, Conway Twitty, Buck Owens, Porter Wagoner, and Hank Williams Jr. This painting is called The Burning of Albuquerque. I think this counts as pop art. That's pretty cool. This one is titled Late Afternoon at La Cueva, depicting the mighty Sandia Mountains. This is a really great landscape. This scene depicts an old New Mexico cemetery. This is a very surreal painting called El Cuerpo de Cristo. You can see the bloodied face of Jesus in the adobe church. His mouth acts as the doorway, and his arms are protruding from the buttresses. This kind of reminds me of a Hieronymus Bosch, though it doesn't depict hell. It's still really creepy. This is a little temple with infusions of Mayan and Egyptian architecture. This is a fetish part made by an artist at Zuni Pueblo. This is the Los Alamos Death Truck. You can see some skeletons in there transporting the atomic bombs from the Los Alamos National Laboratory with Satan in tow. That's interesting. Among some other folk art pieces, that one is called Cuba Missiles, and it depicts Khrushchev removing nuclear weapons from Cuba while Fidel Castro yells at him. That is a folk art car seat, and this is the Chima altar in a Ford 3. This lowrider dashboard view shows the scenery of northern New Mexico and features the Virgin of Guadalupe, along with some other holy relics, and an Illuminati triangle in the mirror. This one is pretty cool. It's called The Music Box by Henriette Wyeth, the daughter of N.C. Wyeth, and it features a German music box with lots of birds. This is the Bhumaswara Mudra. In this, the Buddha performs the earth-affirming hand gesture. This painting is called The Approaching Storm. This is a depiction of Starvation Peak along the Santa Fe Trail. According to legend, some either Spanish or American settlers climbed atop the narrow peak to escape native warriors, but they starved to death up there. There are lots of contemporary works in this museum as well. Again, almost all these works are by artists who have lived in Albuquerque. but part of this section is closed off for the time being. Here's a Jerry West piece called A New Mexico Procession, a really interesting interpretation of the Land of Enchantment. This one is called Hot Country. There's also a small exhibit on the artwork of Luis Jimenez. This one is titled El Buen Pastor. This depicts 18-year-old Ezekiel Hernandez Jr., an American citizen who is herding his family's goats near the Mexican border when camouflage Marines shot and killed him. The FBI concluded he was not a threat, but no one ever faced repercussions for the killing. The exhibit has many of Jimenez's sketches and feature Native American and Hispanic imagery. This is a sketch for the Sodbuster, a giant sculpture Jimenez was commissioned to make by Fargo, North Dakota. Jimenez did a similar statue that's here at this museum we'll see later. This one is called The Border Crossing, showing a man carrying his wife and child across the Rio Grande. And this is the Southwest Pieta, an indigenous version of the Pieta. This is actually a variation of a famous Mexican folktale. Moving on to the Only in Albuquerque exhibit, which is about the history of New Mexico's largest city. They have a big satellite photo map of the sprawling city. It actually covers a lot of ground. And though nothing is labeled, I was able to locate this museum in Old Town. The city has really neat geography. The Sandia Mountains tower over the desert landscape, and here's some Sandia granite. This is pretty amazing. The original reception desk bell from the Alvarado Hotel. The Alvarado was a big Harvey hotel built along the Santa Fe Railroad here in Albuquerque. It was a magnificent historic structure. Tragically, it was torn down in the 1970s, but it's neat to see a piece of it. Here are some iron ember tongs from about 1770. These would be used to keep home fires burning. This was a flashlight owned by Raymond Hetzel, a blacksmith in the adjacent Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad back shop here in Albuquerque, where he would use this flashlight to work on the underside of locomotives. There's a blanket from a local pueblo, along with some turquoise jewelry, and here's a polychrome jar from a regional pueblo. It was made around 1940. This display features a French map from 1656, displaying Le Nouveau Mexique et la Florida, so some of the Spanish holdings in North America. The rest of the history exhibits are currently closed, but here's a word cloud about Albuquerque. I see the Alvarado Hotel on there. Here's another word cloud about the social and economic history of Albuquerque. This exhibit is also closed. This section is also closed off. I guess I'll have to come back for the history exhibits. There's also a special exhibit on Jose Guadalupe Posada, the legendary printmaker of Mexico. Posada was a very well-known Mexican illustrator and lithographer during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His illustrations were often political cartoons and critiques, sometimes quite macabre, so this should be interesting. Jose Guadalupe Posada spent much of his life creating commercial lithographs for newspapers, which were usually politically based. He was inspired by a terrible flood that killed thousands in his hometown to start creating illustrations, usually featuring skeletons and death-related themes, and that continued throughout the rest of his life. Much of his work is also very satirical. Despite the heavy topics he approached, he also very much focused on the social tensions within Mexico leading up to the Mexican Revolutionary War. Here's an actual printing plate featuring Saint Santiago. He did religious prints as well. This is an illustrated portrait of General Porfirio Diaz, who was basically the dictator of Mexico for about 30 years. This engraving from 1912 depicts the near execution of Pancho Villa. He was not actually executed in 1912 when this was made, though he was positioned to be executed by a firing squad, just like the illustration shows, but he was spared at the last minute. Later on, he invaded this state. He raided the town of Columbus, New Mexico. Mexican Revolution leader Francisco Madero, who replaced Diaz after he was finally removed, is depicted here as a skeleton, or a calavera as they are known in Mexico. And here is a calavera of Emiliano Zapata, one of the other leaders of the complicated Mexican Revolution, which occurred around the time of Posada's death. These are actually among his last prints. Zapata was the leader of the Zapatismos, an agricultural peasant-based camp of the revolution, but he ended up being assassinated. Here is a broadside from when General Diaz resigned. He said farewell to the Mexican nation in 1911 and left in exile. The Rural Guard, or Los Rurales, had been established in the 1860s. Diaz ended up using them to impose his will, but Posada created these two patriotic images of them. I guess he never went too hard on Diaz until he was gone. This one is dark. It is titled The Calavera of the Brave Ku Klux Klan. I'm pretty sure this is supposed to be a satirical take on the Klan, as the Klansman has a pile of skulls behind him, and he's holding the burning cross. That is really creepy and terrifying. This one is called the Calavera Bolshevik. Posada also created some whimsical board games. Some of his games are still played in Mexico today. This original print is a board for Goose Game. I'm not sure what the rules were, but that's pretty neat. In this one, a Calavera Don Quixote gallops on a Calavera horse, and there are all sorts of skeletons running away. Don Quixote says in Spanish, "Repent your sins if you wish to save your soul from the torments of the grave." Here's the original print and the printing plates side by side. Posada would usually create these printing plates as acid etchings or lead engravings. This one is titled The Children's Gallery of the Devil's Theater. It looks like Satan towers over some children. There's also a few illustrations on display predating Posada's career. This cartoon is from 1862, and it is a caricature of Napoleon III, who ordered the French occupation of Mexico, actually the second one. And this cartoon pokes fun at the emperor, showing that he could never fit the hat of his notorious uncle. This one is titled La Orchestra. Maximilian and his supporters are unhappy with the emperor's actions from 1864. I think these illustrate that the Mexicans were not happy with the new French occupation. Posada's publisher was Antonio Venegas Arroyo, who published widely circulated penny papers similar to the ones on exhibit here. He printed a new one every single day. Here's a few more Posada prints. This one is titled The Racket of Dandy and Drunkard Skulls. This is a depiction of purgatory. There's lots of calaveras here. And this is the Pantheon of the Dead. This was made by a follower of Posada after the Mexican Revolution during the 1920s, and shows a calavera woman bobbing her hair. So this was an interesting exhibit. I was unaware of Posada and his unique illustrations, so this was a really great showcase of turn-of-the-century Mexican history and culture. This is Progress 1, a fantastic sculpture by Luis Jimenez. It depicts a Native American hunter on horseback shooting a bison with his bow. This 1974 sculpture is actually made of fiberglass. Jimenez was apparently a pioneer of fiberglass art, which became a roadside American staple. You can see there are some bizarre color choices and even some glitter on the sculpture, and the dying bison's eyes are glowing red. There is also an atrium within the building that has some sculptures. Visitors can actually go out here and take a closer look. I like this one. It's titled Georges Braque visited by the conquering Venus, armed with the apples of discord. That's a very confusing title, but this sculpture really does look like a Braque still life. That was the first thing I thought of when I saw it. Well, I think I've covered all the open exhibits, but there is yet another sculpture garden here at the museum. Nestled right up next to Old Town Albuquerque is the West Sculpture Garden. By the way, I did film a video on Old Town today, so make sure to take a look at that. Anyways, this is a bronze cowboy and his horse. This was done by William Moyers, who was an animation artist for Disney. There's some turquoise colored stone with some antique tractor wheels attached to both sides. Here's a sculpture of Julia Seligman seated on a bench. She was a local who volunteered at this museum. This is the Esperanza Bar. I believe that is the head of Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote. Here's a sculpture of Saint Francis, who is basically the patron saint of the Land of Enchantment. And here are Les Bears, two bears just chilling in the courtyard. Also, there is a time capsule back here. It was planned in 1993 and is supposed to be opened in 2050. So that was the Albuquerque Museum of Art and History. A really great and high quality local museum with some interesting art. Again, I did visit for a major special exhibition on Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, and Mexican modernism, so I would highly recommend taking a look at that video, which will be linked in the description. If you enjoyed this tour of the museum, then please like the video, share it, and subscribe for more. I have filmed other videos on historic sites, museums, and more here in Albuquerque, across New Mexico, and across the country. Thanks for watching.